And now we begin Daf Chaf Beis Amud Beis. Mar Zutra is going to bring a proof to answer a question of Rami Bar Chama based on the brisa that we just learned on Chaf Aleph Amud Beis. So just to quickly review the brisa says that if Leah was matfis ha-nazirus on the nazirus of Rachel, and then Rachel's husband was mefer the nazirus, nevertheless, although Rachel's nazirus is gone, Leah's nazirus is still very much valid. Mar Zutra Berei the Rav Mori Omar Hai Hainu de Rami Bar Chama. That this brisa really is going to be a clear-cut pshitus. Pshitus means to resolve the suffix of Rami Bar Chama. Now let's keep in mind that what Mar Zutra is trying to accomplish is an analogy. And at the end of the day, the Gemara is going to say midami, that maybe the analogy is not precise. So that Rami Bar Chama is going to have a suffix in one particular scenario, about one particular din, and Mar Zutra is going to claim that he has an analogy, a parallel from the brisa that we're learning about the fact that Leah remains a Nazira despite the fact that the Baal was Mefer Rachel's Nazirus. The boy Rami Bar Chama, what was Rami Bar Chama vacillating about? Now we're talking about a person, in front of him is a chatichas basar mikarban shlomim, and the status of karban shlomim depends upon before Zrikas Adam as opposed to after Zrikas Adam. After Zrikas Adam, a karban shlomim could be nechal for 2 days and 1 night in Yerushalayim for anybody. The bailim can eat the karban, the basar are karban. However, before Zrikas Adam, the basar is asur, and it's called the davar nadur because the Isur came as a result of the Akdosh. So whether or not you could be matfis a neder onto basar shlomim would depend upon before Zrika, when the basar shlomim is considered a davar nadur, it's asur, or after Zrika, because then it's a davar shel heter. You can't be matfis on a davar shel heter. So a man came along and he was matfis his kikar onto basar shlomim that's on the table. Harei alai kibasar zevach shlomim. Mao. And you and I would have said intuitively that for sure his hatfasa is not chal because he's being matfis on a davar mutar. He's got basar shlomim on his table. So what was the suffix? Why bechalzos does Rami Bar Chana think it might be a valid neder and hatfasa is chal? Ki matfis inish mei kara matfis. Because when a person is matvis, he doesn't mean the basar shlomim as it is today. He's being matvis in the concept on a theoretical level of basar shlomim, meaning basar shlom before zrika. The very fact that he tries to be matvis a kikar onto basar shlomim and created neder and generated Isur on the kikar lechem, that itself is proof positive that he's interested in meikara, in the status of shlom before zrika. Oh, dilmano bitzinin matfis. He's matfis in the basar shlomim as they are on the table, which is not meikara, but rather it's called sofo, or in Aramaic it's called sinina. And that's liachar zrikas damim. Therefore, it's a davar mutar b'achila, and you cannot be matfis a kikar onto a carbon that's mutar b'achila. Now, Mar Zutra thinks that he could be poshet this suffix of Rami Bar Chama based on the brisa that we're learning about Rachel and Leah. Rachel was mekabelas nazirus. Leah said vani. The Baal of Rachel was Mefer Rachel's Nazirus, and we said that Rachel is Muteres, but Leah is Asura. So we see clearly that when Leah was matfis in Rachel's Nazirus, it was meikara matfis. In other words, her atfasa was on Rachel's Nazirus mitchilasa, as it was at the moment of hatfasa. If, on the other hand, we would use the svara of Odilma B'Tsinina Matfis, meaning Besof, then in this case, Besof, since the Baal at the end of the day was Mefer her, meaning Rachel's Nazirus, then the din would be that this would be like being Matfis Peros or Kikar, the Basar Shlamim, after it's Mutter, which would be Lebasov. So it's impossible to justify the psak that Leah is still in a valid Nazirus if you hold a Basov. The only way you can understand it is if you go back to Meikara. And if you go back to Meikara, then at that moment in time, Rachel had accepted upon herself a valid Nazirus. And the Gemara says, Midami. This is not a valid analogy. And the Gemara now is going to differentiate between the case of being matfis a kikar in Basar Shlamim before Zrika, as opposed to the case of Leah being matfis her Nazirus on Rachel. Hasam in the case of being matfis a kikar on Basar Shlamim before Zrika is came on the Yomar Real like in Basar Zebach Shlamim. There's as far to say Meikara because Afal Gav Deliacher Shenizrak Domo Motzi Ochele Bachutz Migdash Kodesh. What does that mean? That it's true. I can't deny that after Zrikas Domim, the Bailim are allowed to eat the carbon. And therefore you would argue that if Libasof, if the Hatfasa is on the Basar Shlomim as it is now on the table after Zrika, then he's being matfis in a Dover Mutter. But the answer is no. Because he's being matfis not in the heter or iser, but rather in the status of kedusha or not kedusha. And even liachar zrika, the shlomim are still sanctified with kedushas carbon. How do I know such a thing? Because if, let's say, he would take the basar shlomim outside of Yerushalayim, michutz Yerushalayim, or, for example, if he would eat the basar shlamim after 2 days and 1 night, he would be violating a severe isa. And therefore, it means that there's kedusha in the carbon now, even after Zrikas Adam. So therefore, we want to assume here that even though he was matfis in the basar, which is now mutar b'achila, he's making a mistake. He thinks he can be matfis in the kedushas carbon, which means that even lebasof after zrika, there's still a kedushas carbon as a vestige from the meikara. So we're going to push in that favor because we want to assume he's a tos. Whatever he did, he made a tos. Aval hachab, in the case of Leah, who is matfis on the Nazirus of Rachel, certainly she was being matfis in the Nazirus as it existed now. Disal kedaita pitznana ka matfis. If you're going to tell me that she's being matfis only lebasov, then in a certain sense, you'd have to agree that there's no meaning to such atfasa because for Labal, at the end of the day, Rachel's Nazirus is completely gone. So therefore, when a person is matfis, we would assume that his intention, his kavana, is to create an Isser on himself. And therefore, in this case, we're going to say meikara. In the case of basar shlamim, we're likewise going to say meikara because he wants to be matfis. But that's for a different reason. And there, the logic that's compelling is that there's still kedusha in the carbon now, even after the zrikas adam, as we proved. So therefore, we're going to say that there's a tos, and that fasa is meaningful because it's still kedushas carbon. And me'achar shemutar mashlam b'achila, if you would say that since he's being matfis now to the situation of basof, that's tznana, there would be no meaning to his neder, because he's being matfis in the dara muta. Another way of rejecting Mar Zutra's analogy is Hainu de Rami bar Chama Vadai. So according to Ika Diamri, we're not going to reject the analogy of Mar Zutra, and we're going to assume Hainu de Rami bar Chama Vadai yesh lifshon es hasafek. And just like in the case where Leah says Vani, she's being matfis bechaberta as she was mitchila meikara. And that's why her Naziris is Chal, even after the Baal was made for Rachel's Naziris. So to here, in a person who's Matfis B'Shlomim, we're going to assume that he was Matfis Meikara in the situation of the Basa before Zrika. Now the Gemara has another suffix. What happens if the Matfeses, meaning if Leah, instead of saying Vani, she uses a different language, she says Hareni Bikvech. So again, Rachel declared Hareni Nazira. Leah listens and she says, Amalei Hareni Nazira bi'ikvech, or bi'ikvayech. Mal. What's the din of Leah? And again, the nafkamina is going to be, if Rachel's husband was Mayfair Rachel's Nazirus, should we still insist that Leah is Asura? And the Gemara explains that study Asafah. Hareni bi'ikvayech Bikula Milsa. Does she mean that she wants to be like Rachel even Basof, as opposed to the previous case where we went back Meikara? And she meant Bikvayech L'chol Davar. I want to be like you, and if at the end of the day you're not going to be Nazira, I'm not going to be Nazira. I'm always a clone of you. And therefore Shari. Oh, Dilma, should we say no? There's no difference between Hareni Nazir B'Kvayech or Va'ani. In both cases, it's Kimekame de Lefer. It's going back to Meikara, to the moment that Rachel was Mekabelas Naziris and Leah said Hareni B'Kvayech Vasira. And therefore, even though the Baal of Rachel removes her Naziris through Hafara, but nevertheless, Hareni B'Kvayech means we're going back to the Kabbalah, the moment of Kabbalah's Naziris, and it's as if Leah had said Vani. Toshma, Ha'isha shenodra bin Nazir, v'shama baila, v'omar va'ani, eino yochel lahofer. When the Baal says Vani, he confirms the Nazirus of his wife, and he was tola his Nazirus onto her Nazirus. And now if he would be Mayfair her Nazirus, he would be in effect being Mayfair his Nazirus. And as we discussed yesterday, Ein habal Mayfair's Nidrei Atzmo, lo yochel dvaro, hu eino mechal dvaro, el acher. The Isal kedatach, if you're going to say, the ki Omar lo hareni b'kvayich, ba'ikara komatvis. And if we're going to say that when Leah declared hareni b'kvayich, she's going back to the moment of Nazirus before Afar, and that's called Meikara. Is Lefer Leila Dida V'lokim Didei. He could be Mayfair his wife's neder, and at the same time he could be make him his own neder, which means the following: if we go back to Meikara Matfis, then he was Matfis in Hanazirus from the moment that she declared Hareni Nazira. And at that moment when he declares Vani, he's being Matfis in her status as it was then. Now he could go ahead and be Mayfair Hanidarim without being Mayfair his own neder. El Lav Shmamino, the only way we could justify this din, as we saw in our Mishnah, is Bekula de Milsa Matfis. That her Hatfasa, meaning Leah's Hatfasa, when she says Hareini Ikvayich or Bi'ikvayich, is Hareini Kemosa L'chol Davar. And therefore it includes not just Meikar, but also Basof. So therefore, in this case, if the Baal would be, after he says Vani, he would be made for his wife's neder, then his neder would fall apart because Bekula Milsa Matfis, meaning Ila Basof. Now we understand why the Baal cannot be Mayfair, because since he said Bekula Milsa Matfis, meaning even Lebasof, then it means that since at the end, if he's made for Haneder, then Memela he's being made for his own neder that he cannot do. Ha'isha di Omra Hareini B'Kvayach. And this woman who declared, meaning Leah, Hareini B'Kvayach, it's as if she said, Hareini Kemosha Atiyah B'Sofeich. And that's why if the Baal would be Mayfair her Rachel's neder, then Hinami Muteris, Leah would also be Muteris. So we see clearly that from this Mishnah, we could prove that Meikar Kamatfis. I'm sorry, just 1 second. That what? I'm sorry, that Besofa Kamatfis, right? What we called before Bisnana, which means Bekula Milsa. Lo, the Gemara rejects it. Liala Meikar B'Matfis. I go back to the original assumption of Meikar. And if the Baal now, who said Vani, and was Matfis' Nazirus and his wife's Nazirus bit Chilasa, if he would be Mayfair, and therefore he wants to retain his status of a Nazirus while undermining her status, then he could be made for her Nazirus, because he's not being Mevatel his Nazirus, because Meikar Komatfis. For Hacha, but here in our Mishnah, why don't we allow him to be made for his wife's Nazirus? Came in the Amar Vani, that the word Vani is a Gili Das, that he's being Mekabel her neder, and he's justifying, or shall we say, approving, that's a better word, of her Nazirus. He's being Mekayim her Nazirus. Now, once a Baal is Mekayim his wife's Nazirus, he can no longer be made for his Nazirus. And therefore, if he will be Shoel on his Hakama, then he could be Mefer. If he goes to a Chacham, because we always say that Hakama is like a Neder itself, he could be Shoel on his Hakama at the Chacham's prerogative, and therefore he would be Mevatel the Hakama, and then he could be Mefer HaNedarim, and his neder would still stand in its place because we're holding Meikar Komatfis. The Mishnah says that if a man says to his wife, Hareini Nozavi At, and he asks her, which you also want to be a Nozavi Omer Amen, so she accepts Nazirus, since as if she said, Hareini Mekabeles Es Dvarecha, is Mefer Eshalah. He could be Mefer her Nazirus, V'Shalo Kayam, but his Nazirus retains its status. Why? Because he was not Tola his Nazirus in her. On the contrary, he asked her if she also wants to be on board, jump on the bandwagon and be a Nazir like he is. And even though she said, yes, I want to be, but nevertheless, he could decide to be made for her Nazirus. And that's what it says in our Mishnah Raminu. The Gemara asks from a steer from a Brisa, and the Brisa says that if a man says to his wife, Hareini Nozavi At, V'Amra Amen, Shnei Masur, meaning he cannot be made for her Nazirus. V'Im Lav, if she did not respond with Amen, then Shnei Mutarim, they should tell her Nidro B'Nidra. In other words, what he was saying to her when he asked V'At was that I want to do it as a joint effort. It's a very romantic couple, so it's a partnership. And I'm accepting my Nazirus only if you will be with me on Nazirus. And that means that if she didn't respond with the word Amen, then Shnei Mutarin. Now, in the Resha of this brisa that we're learning now, if she said Amen, Shnei Asurim, and there he cannot be Mefer Har Nazirus, that's a contradiction to what we learned in our Mishnah, that if she says Amen, he could be Mefer Ha Nazirus, why his Nazirus still exists. And the Gemara answers, Rabbi Yehuda changed the girsa of the brisa, and Tani, it should say in the brisa, Mefer Eshalah, V'Shalo Kayam. And therefore, it's exactly equivalent to our Mishnah. And Abai is not excited about the fact that you have to change the girsa. We're not going to change the girsa. I can still reconcile the steer between the brisa and the Mishnah. Brisa could go into Amrla Hareini Nazir Vi'at to Katoli Nidro B'Nidra. So if he says Vi'at, meaning it's like a joint effort of Nazirus, so we want to be partners in Nazirus, and it's as if he said Eye Nazir Im Gam Atiyeh Nazira. Therefore, he cannot be Mefer HaNeder to Katoli Nidra B'Nidra. Because if he's going to be Mefer HaNeder, it's an all or nothing proposition, then in effect he's being Mefer his own Neder, which he cannot do. And now we turn to Daf Chav Gimel. Umasnisen Kigon the Amrla Hareini Nazir Viat Mai. But the Mishnah is talking about a case where he accepted upon himself Nazirus, and then he asks his wife, and what about you? What's your opinion? Do you want to be Makabel Nazirus? He wasn't told his Nazirus on her Nazirus. It wasn't a package deal and a romantic partnership here in the Nazirus. Mishum Hachi, and that's why in the Mishnah it says Mefer Shalah. He can be made for her Nazirus, but doesn't mean that therefore ipso facto his Nazirus is invalidated. V'shalo Kayam, and his Nazirus is independent of her. So that's what we have for today. And Mirza Hashem, tomorrow we'll learn Daf Chav Gimel. Thank you so much, and have a great day.